In 1881, archaeologists discovered something impossible in an English cave: a child's skeleton that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about human evolution. But it would take 140 years before DNA technology revealed her most shocking secret. She had piercing blue eyes and skin as dark as midnight. The White Hawk Cave sits on the chalky hills overlooking what is now Brighton, England. In 1881, a team of Victorian archaeologists descended into its depths, expecting to find pottery shards or stone tools. What they found instead would haunt the archaeological community for over a century. The skeleton belonged to a child, approximately 5 years old. She had been buried in what researchers call a crouched position, her knees drawn up to her chest, her tiny arms folded across her body. This wasn't a hasty burial. Someone had taken great care with her final resting place. Around her bones lay objects that spoke of status and wealth. Copper beads, carefully crafted from materials that had traveled hundreds of miles. Flint tools of exceptional quality. Seashells that had been painstakingly polished and arranged. In the Neolithic period, such grave goods meant one thing: this child came from a family of importance. The Victorian archaeologists sketched her bones, catalogued the artifacts, and filed their reports. They assumed she was simply another ancient Briton, pale-skinned, perhaps fair-haired, an ancestor of the modern English population. The skeleton was placed in storage at the Brighton Museum, where it would sit, largely forgotten, for generations. But those Victorian scientists had no way of knowing that locked inside her bones was a code, a genetic message that would challenge every assumption about human migration, evolution, and the very concept of race itself. They couldn't have imagined that this 5-year-old girl would become one of the most important archaeological finds in British history. As decades passed, the White Hawk girl remained in her museum drawer. 2 world wars came and went. The fields above her burial cave became housing developments. Technology advanced, from horse-drawn carriages to space shuttles. And still, her greatest secrets remained hidden, waiting for science to catch up with history. The few archaeologists who knew of her existence in the mid-20th century could only speculate. Was she a chieftain's daughter? Had she died of disease or accident? Why had her community invested such effort in her burial? The answers seemed lost to time. Then, in the early 2000s, a revolution began in archaeological science. Researchers discovered that certain bones in the human body preserve DNA far better than others. The petrous bone, the dense pyramid-shaped bone that houses the inner ear, became the holy grail of ancient DNA research. It could preserve genetic material for thousands of years, protected from the degradation that destroys DNA in other parts of the skeleton. The White Hawk girl's petrous bone had survived intact. When museum curators received a request from geneticists to sample it, they agreed. No one anticipated what those samples would reveal. No one could have predicted that this forgotten child would force us to completely reimagine what ancient Europeans looked like. The extraction process began in a sterile laboratory, where scientists used specialized drills to collect microscopic amounts of bone powder. This powder contained DNA fragments, broken chains of genetic code that had survived 5,600 years of chemical decay. It was a race against time and degradation, searching for intact sequences among millions of damaged fragments. Modern DNA laboratories look nothing like the dusty archaeological sites where specimens are found. They're sterile environments where researchers wear full protective suits, not to protect themselves, but to protect the ancient DNA from contamination by modern genetic material. A single stray skin cell, a lone strand of hair, could ruin months of work. The White Hawk Girl's bone powder underwent a process called next-generation sequencing. Imagine trying to reassemble a book that's been through a shredder, then left outside for thousands of years, with most pages missing, and the remaining ones torn into confetti-sized pieces. That's what ancient DNA analysis involves. Researchers must identify those tiny fragments, determine where they belong in the human genome, and reconstruct enough of the code to answer questions about ancestry, appearance, and health. The first breakthrough came quickly. Carbon dating, using radioactive isotope decay, placed her death at approximately 5,600 years ago, far older than the original Victorian estimate. She lived during the Neolithic Revolution, when agriculture was spreading across Europe, but hunter-gatherer communities still dominated Britain. As more genetic data accumulated, researchers began building a picture of her ancestry. The human genome contains roughly 3 billion base pairs, the chemical letters that spell out our genetic code. Ancient DNA rarely survives intact, but even partial sequences can reveal remarkable information. Scientists compared her DNA to reference databases containing genetic information from hundreds of ancient populations across Europe and Asia. The results showed something unexpected. Her genome didn't match the genetic signature of modern British people. It didn't even match the later Neolithic farmers who would eventually dominate Britain. Instead, her DNA aligned closely with a population known as Western European hunter-gatherers, people who had lived in Europe since the Ice Age ended, surviving by hunting animals and gathering wild plants. This discovery led to more questions. How had her family reached Britain? The answer lay in a vanished landscape called Doggerland. During the Stone Age, sea levels were lower than today. Where the North Sea now separates Britain from continental Europe, there once existed a land bridge, actually an entire subcontinent with its own rivers, hills, and ecosystems. Doggerland allowed populations to migrate from mainland Europe to Britain on foot, carrying their genes, their culture, and their technologies with them. The White Hawk Girl's ancestors had been part of these migrations. They had walked across landscapes now drowned beneath cold ocean waters. They had adapted to new environments, learned to exploit new resources, and established communities in a land that would eventually become an island. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Geneticists had developed techniques to predict physical appearance from DNA. Specific genes control skin pigmentation, hair color, and eye color. By identifying which variants of these genes a person carried, researchers could reconstruct what they looked like with surprising accuracy. The team analyzing the White Hawk Girl's DNA began examining genes related to pigmentation. They found variants associated with dark skin melanin production, the same variants common in sub-Saharan African populations. Her skin would have been dark brown to black, not the pale complexion that modern people associate with Northern Europeans. Then came the truly bizarre finding. Among her genes were variants strongly associated with blue eyes. Not hazel, not green, but vivid, striking blue. The combination seemed impossible. A mistake, perhaps, or contamination from a modern source. The researchers ran the tests again and again. Each time, the results remained consistent. The White Hawk Girl had dark skin and blue eyes, a combination virtually unknown in any modern population. She represented a stage in human evolution that no longer exists, a transitional period when different traits evolved at different rates. Understanding why the White Hawk Girl looked the way she did requires understanding human evolution itself. Our species, Homo sapiens, originated in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. All early humans had dark skin, an adaptation to intense equatorial sunlight that protected against UV radiation damage and folate depletion. As humans migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they encountered environments with less sunlight. Dark skin, while protective in Africa, became a disadvantage in northern climates. Humans need sunlight to produce vitamin D, essential for bone development and immune function. Dark melanin, which blocks UV radiation, also reduces vitamin D production. In cloudy northern regions, this created selective pressure favoring lighter skin. But evolution doesn't happen overnight. It requires many generations, with individuals carrying advantageous traits having slightly more surviving offspring than those without. The genetic variants for lighter skin had to appear through random mutation, then spread through populations over thousands of years. The White Hawk girl lived during this transition period. Her population had been in Europe for millennia, but the genetic variants for light skin hadn't yet become dominant. She and her community represented an intermediate stage. People adapted to European climates through technology and culture, but not yet through biology. The blue eyes told another story. The specific genetic variant responsible for blue eyes in Europeans, a mutation in a gene called HERK2, appears to have originated approximately 10,000 years ago. It spread rapidly through European populations, possibly through random chance in small, isolated communities, or perhaps because people found blue eyes attractive and preferentially chose blue-eyed partners. This variant reached Britain with the same migrating populations who brought the White Hawk girl's ancestors. But crucially, it spread faster than the skin-lightening variants. For thousands of years, European populations could have dark skin and blue eyes simultaneously, a combination that strikes modern observers as impossible because we've never seen it in living populations. The genetic evidence revealed another surprising detail about her appearance. Analysis of genes controlling hair texture showed she likely had dark, lightly coiled hair, another trait associated with African ancestry that hadn't yet been replaced by the straight or wavy hair variants common in modern Europeans. Imagine her, a 5-year-old girl with skin like polished ebony, eyes the color of glacial ice, and tight curls framing her face. She would have looked unlike anyone alive today, a living reminder that human appearance is more fluid and variable than our modern categories suggest. This discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about race and appearance. In modern times, we associate specific combinations of traits with specific populations: blue eyes with pale skin, dark skin with brown eyes. These associations seem natural, inevitable, but they're recent developments, products of the last few thousand years of evolution and population mixing. The White Hawk girl proved that these trait combinations are neither ancient nor fixed. They're temporary configurations, snapshots of a constantly evolving species. The people who buried her probably never questioned her appearance. To them, she looked normal, because everyone in their community looked similar. Researchers began examining other ancient DNA samples from the same period. They found the same pattern repeated across Europe. Early Neolithic hunter-gatherers consistently showed dark skin and light eyes. The familiar European appearance, pale skin, light eyes, and light hair, only became dominant after Bronze Age migrations brought new populations from the eastern steppes, carrying different genetic variants. This timeline revision had profound implications. It meant that the typical European appearance is only about 4,000 years old, incredibly recent in evolutionary terms. It meant that appearance-based concepts of European identity have no deep historical roots. And it meant that human diversity is far stranger and more complex than simple visual categories suggest. DNA contains more than information about appearance. It carries a record of ancestry, a genetic genealogy stretching back thousands of generations. By comparing the White Hawk Girl's genome to other ancient samples, researchers could trace her family's journey across time and space. Her closest genetic relatives weren't found in Britain. They came from sites scattered across continental Europe, cave burials in Spain, rock shelters in France, coastal settlements in Denmark. These people shared a common ancestry, descendants of populations who had survived the last ice age in southern European refugia, then expanded northward as glaciers retreated. Approximately 12,000 years ago, as temperatures warmed and ice sheets melted, these hunter-gatherer groups spread across Europe. They weren't farmers. They didn't plant crops or keep livestock. Instead, they lived by hunting deer, wild boar, and aurochs, the massive wild cattle that roamed European forests. They fished rivers and coastlines. They gathered nuts, berries, roots, and edible plants. These were sophisticated people with deep ecological knowledge. They understood animal migration patterns, knew which plants were edible in each season, and possessed technologies refined over thousands of years. They made composite tools, mixing materials like wood, stone, and bone. They created art, carved figurines, and almost certainly had complex languages and belief systems. The White Hawk Girl's ancestors crossed into Britain when it was still connected to Europe. Doggerland wasn't just a narrow land bridge. It was a thriving ecosystem the size of modern Britain. Rivers drained across it. Forests grew on its hills. Archaeological evidence suggests people lived there permanently, exploiting both terrestrial and marine resources. Around 6,500 years ago, catastrophic flooding submerged Doggerland. A massive underwater landslide off Norway's coast, the Storegga Slide, triggered tsunamis that swept across the North Sea. Combined with rising sea levels from melting glaciers, this created the maritime barrier that isolated Britain. The White Hawk Girls community found themselves cut off from continental populations, their ancestral lands beneath the waves. But they weren't Britain's only inhabitants. Another population had recently arrived. Neolithic farmers from the Middle East, carrying revolutionary technologies. Domesticated wheat and barley, sheep and cattle, pottery for storing food. These farmers had spread across Europe like a slow-motion wave, replacing or absorbing hunter-gatherer populations. The genetic evidence revealed something fascinating about the White Hawk Girls community. Unlike many European hunter-gatherers, they showed no sign of mixing with these incoming farmers. Their DNA was pure Western hunter-gatherer, suggesting they had maintained their traditional lifestyle and avoided intermarriage with the newcomers. This cultural conservatism appeared in other evidence too. The artifacts buried with her, stone tools rather than pottery, wild animal bones rather than domesticated livestock, all indicated a community resistant to agricultural revolution. They clung to the old ways, the hunter-gatherer existence their ancestors had perfected over millennia. Why this resistance? Perhaps they viewed farming as unnecessary or inferior. Hunter-gatherers, when successful, often worked fewer hours than farmers and enjoyed more varied diets. Agriculture demanded constant labor, tied people to specific locations, and created vulnerability to crop failures. For communities thriving on traditional methods, farming might have seemed like a step backward. Or perhaps the division was territorial. The hunters held the best coastal and riverine territories, rich in fish and game. The farmers settled interior valleys, clearing forests for fields. The two groups simply occupied different ecological niches with little reason for interaction. This genetic isolation couldn't last forever. Within a few centuries of the White Hawk Girl's death, hunter-gatherer DNA largely disappeared from Britain. The farmers' population advantage, higher birth rates, ability to support larger communities, eventually overwhelmed the traditional populations. By the Bronze Age, British DNA showed predominantly farmer ancestry, with only trace amounts of hunter-gatherer genes remaining. The White Hawk girl represented one of the last pure hunter-gatherer populations in Britain. She and her community stood at the end of a cultural tradition stretching back tens of thousands of years, the final generation before a new world replaced the old. Bones record more than just ancestry. They preserve chemical signatures of the food consumed during life. As a child grows, minerals from food incorporate into developing teeth and bones. Different food sources leave different isotopic fingerprints, slight variations in the ratios of carbon, nitrogen, and other elements. Researchers extracted tiny samples from the White Hawk girl's teeth and subjected them to isotopic analysis. The results painted a detailed picture of her diet and environment. The nitrogen isotope ratios indicated significant consumption of animal protein, particularly from terrestrial sources. She ate meat from deer, boar, and other forest animals. The carbon isotopes revealed consumption of wild plant foods, nuts, berries, roots, and tubers gathered from forests and meadows. Crucially, the isotopic signature showed no evidence of cultivated grains. She had never eaten wheat or barley, the staple crops of Neolithic farmers. Her communities still lived entirely from wild resources. Marine isotopes appeared in lower concentrations, suggesting occasional consumption of fish or shellfish. The White Hawk Cave sits miles from the modern coast, but sea levels were different 5,600 years ago, and rivers provided access to estuarine environments. Her people probably made seasonal trips to the coast, gathering shellfish and fishing rivers during productive months. But the isotopic evidence revealed something more concerning. Variations in isotope ratios within single teeth indicated periods of nutritional stress. As teeth grow, they lay down layers of enamel like tree rings. Analysis of these layers showed seasonal fluctuations in diet quality, abundant food in summer and autumn, scarcity in winter and early spring. This pattern matched what anthropologists know about hunter-gatherer subsistence. Without stored grain or livestock to slaughter, hunter-gatherer communities faced hunger seasons when wild resources dwindled. Late winter and early spring, before new plant growth and animal births, were particularly difficult. Children, with higher metabolic needs and smaller body reserves, suffered most during these lean periods. The White Hawk girl's tooth enamel showed defects called enamel hypoplasia, horizontal grooves and pits indicating periods when growth temporarily stopped due to illness or malnutrition. These marks suggested she had survived at least 2 episodes of severe stress before her death. Her young body had endured hardships modern children in developed nations rarely face. Researchers also examined her bones for evidence of infectious disease. Ancient DNA can preserve fragments of bacterial and viral genomes, allowing identification of pathogens that killed people thousands of years ago. In the White Hawk girl's case, analysis revealed genetic sequences matching bacteria known to cause severe fever and infection. The specific pathogen couldn't be identified with certainty. DNA degrades over time, and many disease-causing bacteria share genetic sequences. But the evidence suggested a rapid, acute infection rather than chronic disease. She probably fell ill suddenly and died within days or weeks. This vulnerability to infection wasn't surprising. Modern humans carry immunity to hundreds of diseases, inherited from ancestors who survived past epidemics. But Neolithic populations had different disease exposures. They lived in small groups, isolated from the crowd diseases that would later devastate agricultural societies. When new pathogens appeared, either through animal contact or rare interactions with other communities, they had no inherited immunity. The bacterial DNA found in her bones might represent a disease her community had never encountered before. Perhaps a pathogen jumped from wild animals to humans, or arrived with traveling strangers. Without previous exposure, without genetic resistance, A 5-year-old's immune system would have struggled to fight the infection. Her bones showed no evidence of violence, no broken ribs or skull fractures suggesting abuse or warfare. She wasn't killed. She simply got sick and died. A common fate for children in every era before modern medicine. Life expectancy in the Neolithic was brutally low, perhaps 30 years on average, with childhood mortality claiming many before age 5. Yet, despite these hardships, the White Hawk girl had received meticulous care in death. This suggests her community valued children, mourned their losses, and maintained sophisticated burial practices even for those who died young. The effort invested in her grave, the carefully positioned body, the valuable grave goods, the choice of a sacred cave location, all indicated deep emotional bonds and complex spiritual beliefs. The manner of burial reveals as much about the living as the dead. When the White Hawk girl died, her community didn't simply dispose of her body. They performed elaborate rituals that required coordination, resources, and emotional investment. Understanding these rituals provides a window into their beliefs, values, and social organization. The White Hawk Cave wasn't randomly chosen. Archaeological evidence shows it had been used for burials over many generations. Multiple skeletons were found in the complex, representing a community cemetery or sacred site. The cave itself possessed symbolic significance. A liminal space between the surface world and the underground, between life and death. Carrying her body to the cave required deliberate effort. The entrance wasn't easily accessible. People had to navigate rough terrain, probably forming a funeral procession. This public display of grief and respect indicates the death wasn't a private family matter, but a community event affecting the entire social group. Inside the cave, they prepared her final resting place. Someone dug a pit in the cave floor, breaking through layers of accumulated sediment to reach bedrock. The pit's size and shape were carefully calculated to accommodate her body in the traditional crouched position, knees drawn up, arms folded. This fetal position wasn't accidental or convenient. It appears consistently in Neolithic burials across Europe, suggesting shared beliefs about death and rebirth. The positioning mimicked an infant in the womb, perhaps reflecting hopes for spiritual rebirth or return to an Earth Mother goddess. It required deliberate arrangement of limbs, probably shortly after death before rigor mortis set in. The grave goods placed around her body carried their own significance. Copper beads, rare and valuable in an age before metalworking became common, indicated trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. Someone had to acquire these beads, either through exchange with distant communities or by obtaining raw copper and crafting them locally. Either option required resources and connections. Polished flint tools accompanied her. These weren't crude implements, but finely crafted artifacts, possibly ceremonial rather than functional. Creating such tools required skill, time, and high-quality stone sources. Their inclusion in a child's grave suggests either that she came from a high-status family or that the community invested heavily in proper burial rites, regardless of the deceased's social position. Seashells, carefully selected and arranged, added another dimension. Shells carried symbolic weight in many prehistoric cultures, representing the sea, transformation, and spiritual journey. The fact that these shells came from distant coasts reinforced the community's connection to broader landscapes, and possibly to spiritual concepts linking death with oceanic depths or coastal boundaries. After positioning the body and arranging the grave goods, mourners filled the pit with earth. They may have performed other rituals, songs, prayers, offerings of food or flowers that left no archaeological trace. The entire process probably took days, from death to final interment, with community members participating in various ceremonial roles. The care evident in this burial contradicts old stereotypes about primitive peoples living brutish, emotionally simple lives. These were humans who grieved, who needed ritual to process loss, who maintained complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. They invested scarce resources in honoring their dead, suggesting that spiritual and emotional needs took precedence over pure survival calculations. Comparative analysis of other Neolithic burials reveals variations that hint at social structure. Some graves contained more elaborate goods, others were simpler. Some individuals were buried in central, prominent locations, others in peripheral areas. These patterns suggest emerging social hierarchies, or at least recognition of individual differences in status, achievement, or spiritual significance. The White Hawk Girl's grave fell in the middle range, not the most elaborate, but far from the simplest. This suggests her family held respectable, if not elite, status. Or perhaps childhood deaths received special treatment regardless of family background, reflecting cultural values that prioritized children as precious community resources. What we cannot know are the emotional details, the tears shed, the prayers spoken, the memories shared. We cannot hear the songs they might have sung, or know what stories they told about where her spirit had gone. These human elements, so central to any funeral, leave no physical trace. Yet the archaeological evidence preserves something equally powerful: proof of love and care transcending death. Whoever buried the White Hawk Girl did so with attention, respect, and ritual complexity that required significant community investment. They mourned her loss and honored her memory in ways their culture deemed appropriate and necessary. This burial represents a profound human constant. Despite vast differences in technology, beliefs, and daily life, humans across all times and cultures have treated death as a transformative moment, requiring ritual response. The White Hawk Girl's funeral, conducted 5,600 years ago by people who would be unrecognizable to us, nevertheless expressed emotions and needs that remain immediately comprehensible: grief, love, hope, and the desire to honor those we've lost. Modern facial reconstruction combines art and science, using skeletal structure and genetic data to recreate the living appearance of long-dead individuals. For the White Hawk Girl, this process began with precise measurements of her skull, every curve, angle, and proportion carefully documented through 3D scanning technology. The human face consists of layers. Bone provides the foundation, muscles attach to specific points on the skull, fat pads fill certain areas, and skin covers everything. By understanding these relationships, specialists can work backward from skeleton to face. Forensic anthropologists began by examining the skull's architecture. The shape of eye sockets influences how the eyes sit in the face. The nasal bones determine nose width and projection. Jaw structure affects face shape and profile. Tooth positions influence lip contours. These skeletal features provided the framework. Next came muscle reconstruction. Specific muscles attach to specific skull landmarks with predictable thickness. The temporalis muscle, used for chewing, fills the temple area. The masseter shapes the jaw. Dozens of facial muscles, each with standard dimensions based on age and sex, were digitally layered onto the skull scan. Tissue depth markers came next. Studies of modern humans have established average soft tissue depths at various facial points. These depths vary by age, sex, and ancestry group. For a 5-year-old child of hunter-gatherer ancestry, researchers consulted databases of tissue measurements from similar populations and age groups. At this stage, the reconstruction showed a generic face, human, childlike, but not yet individual. The crucial step came in applying the DNA evidence. The genetic data provided specific information that transformed the reconstruction from general to particular. Skin color presented the first major decision. The DNA clearly indicated dark brown to black skin, expressing high levels of melanin. The reconstruction team applied skin tones matching sub-Saharan African populations, the closest modern analog to her genetic pigmentation profile. This choice immediately contradicted viewer expectations. People don't anticipate seeing dark skin on a 5,600-year-old British skeleton. The eyes required careful attention. Blue eyes result from specific structural features in the iris that scatter light. The DNA indicated she carried the genetic variants for blue eyes, but eye color genes interact in complex ways. The team chose a vivid light blue, the color most consistent with her specific genetic profile. Setting these striking blue eyes in a dark-skinned face created the reconstruction's most startling feature. Hair presented another challenge. DNA indicated dark color and tightly coiled texture, similar to sub-Saharan African hair types. The reconstruction team created tight curls framing her face, texture hair that contrasted sharply with the straight or wavy hair usually associated with European populations. Facial features followed skeletal structure. Her nose, relatively wide with a low bridge, reflected both her genetic ancestry and the skeletal evidence. Her lips, slightly full, matched her ancestry group and the underlying bone structure. Her face shape, round and childlike, as befits a 5-year-old, came directly from skull measurements. When the reconstruction was complete, it showed a child who looked unlike anyone alive today. Dark skin, bright blue eyes, tightly curled black hair, a combination that has vanished from human populations. She represented a snapshot of human evolution at a specific moment, capturing traits that would later separate into different populations, but once existed together. The public reaction, when the reconstruction was revealed, mixed fascination with discomfort. Many people struggled to reconcile their assumptions about European history with the reality the science presented. Comments ranged from amazement to skepticism to outright denial. Some insisted the reconstruction must be wrong, that dark skin and blue eyes couldn't coexist. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple independent DNA analyses confirmed the findings. The reconstruction team had followed established protocols, relying on data rather than assumptions. The White Hawk girl's appearance might seem impossible to modern eyes, but that reflects our limited experience, not biological impossibility. Museums displaying the reconstruction faced difficult choices about interpretation. How do you explain complex population genetics to general audiences? How do you challenge deeply held assumptions about race and appearance without triggering defensive reactions? The reconstruction became as much an educational tool as a scientific achievement. The White Hawk girl's DNA didn't just reveal her individual appearance, it prompted a comprehensive reassessment of European prehistory. Researchers returned to other ancient skeletons, re-examining remains that had been analyzed with older, less sophisticated techniques. The results were revolutionary. Across Europe, ancient DNA from the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods showed the same pattern. Dark skin combined with light eyes. The famous Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest complete skeleton at 10,000 years old, yielded similar results. Dark to black skin, blue eyes. Samples from Spain, Luxembourg, Hungary all told the same story. This consistency revealed something profound about human evolution. The genetic variants controlling skin pigmentation and eye color evolved independently, at different rates, in response to different selective pressures. They weren't packaged together as an unchangeable unit, but represented separate evolutionary trajectories. Light eyes appeared relatively early in European populations, possibly spreading through sexual selection or random genetic drift in small, isolated groups. The HERC2 gene variant responsible for blue eyes may have reached fixation, becoming universal in a population simply through chance, with no adaptive advantage required. Lighter skin followed a different timeline. The genetic variants most common in modern Europeans appeared more recently, probably within the last 8,000 years. They spread rapidly once they appeared, driven by strong selective pressure. In northern latitudes with limited sunlight, lighter skin allowed better vitamin D production, providing real survival advantages. But this transition didn't happen instantly or uniformly. For thousands of years, European populations existed in an intermediate state, adapted to European climates through culture and technology, but not yet fully adapted genetically. They wore clothes, built shelters, and used fire to cope with cold. They didn't need genetic adaptations for cold tolerance, because cultural adaptations worked. The revolution in skin color came with agricultural expansion. New populations migrated into Europe from the Middle East and the Pontic steppes, bringing different genetic variants, including those for lighter skin. These populations mixed with existing hunter-gatherers, and their genes spread rapidly. Within a few thousand years, the genetic landscape of Europe had completely transformed. This new timeline had significant implications for how we understand race. Modern concepts of race often assume ancient, stable categories, that Europeans have always looked European, Africans have always looked African. The genetic evidence demolished these assumptions. Appearance changes relatively rapidly in evolutionary terms, responding to environmental pressures and population movements. The White Hawk girl exemplified this fluidity. She was unquestionably European, born in Britain, descended from populations who had lived in Europe for thousands of years. But she didn't look European in the modern sense. The association between European ancestry and light skin is recent, contingent, temporary. This research also illuminated the concept of adaptation. Humans adapt through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Cultural adaptation, developing new technologies, behaviors, and knowledge, happens faster than biological adaptation through genetic change. The White Hawk girl's people had culturally adapted to European environments long before they genetically adapted through lighter skin. The speed of cultural adaptation explains human success. Unlike other species, which must wait for beneficial mutations to appear and spread over thousands of generations, humans can develop new solutions within single lifetimes and transmit them through teaching and imitation. Clothing, fire, shelter, hunting technologies. These cultural innovations allowed humans to colonize every environment on Earth without requiring specific genetic adaptations for each. Only when cultural adaptations prove insufficient does genetic adaptation provide additional advantages. In Northern Europe's low-light conditions, cultural adaptations couldn't fully compensate for vitamin D deficiency. Lighter skin provided a biological solution to a problem culture couldn't entirely solve, leading to rapid selection for relevant genetic variants. These findings challenged nationalist narratives that invoke ancient ancestry to justify modern ethnic identities. The research showed that contemporary European populations represent recent mixtures of multiple ancient groups, none of which resembled modern Europeans in appearance or genetics. Claiming unbroken descent from specific ancient peoples becomes meaningless when those ancient peoples looked completely different and had completely different genetic profiles. The White Hawk girl embodied this complexity. She wasn't a simple ancestor of modern British people. Her genetic lineage largely disappeared from the British gene pool within centuries of her death, overwhelmed by incoming farmer populations. Yet she represented a crucial chapter in the story of how humans colonized and adapted to Europe. A story far more intricate than simple narratives of stable ethnic groups occupying ancestral homelands. Before DNA analysis, the White Hawk Girl was silent, a collection of bones that could tell us her approximate age at death, her burial position, and the culture of those who buried her. But her individual identity, her appearance, her ancestry, remained speculation. DNA gave her a voice, allowing her to speak across 5,600 years of silence. This transformation represents one of archaeology's most powerful recent developments. For centuries, archaeologists could describe past cultures, but struggled to access individual lives. We could catalog pottery styles, map settlement patterns, trace technological change. But the people themselves, what they looked like, where they came from, how they related to each other, remained shadowy. Ancient DNA changed this fundamentally. Now we can extract individual biographies from anonymous bones. We can determine sex, even when skeletal indicators are ambiguous. We can identify family relationships, revealing which individuals were siblings, parents and children, or unrelated. We can trace population movements across continents and millennia. For the White Hawk Girl, DNA revealed she was part of a dying culture. Her hunter-gatherer ancestry marked her as a member of populations being replaced by incoming farmers. Within a few centuries of her death, people with her genetic profile would virtually disappear from Britain, their genes diluted to trace amounts in the mixed populations that followed. This knowledge adds poignancy to her burial. The community that interred her with such care was itself facing extinction, though they couldn't have known it. The traditional ways of life they maintained, the hunting skills, the seasonal migrations, the intimate knowledge of wild landscapes, would soon become obsolete as agriculture transformed the British environment. Yet this loss wasn't complete extinction. Small amounts of hunter-gatherer DNA persisted in later populations, suggesting some intermarriage and genetic exchange. The White Hawk Girl's DNA didn't entirely vanish. It became diluted, mixed with incoming farmer genes, spread across thousands of descendants. In this sense, she has millions of partial descendants in modern Britain, though none carry her distinctive combination of traits. DNA analysis also revealed connections between geographically distant populations. The White Hawk Girl's genome matched samples from sites hundreds of miles away, showing that Mesolithic Europe contained interconnected populations rather than completely isolated groups. People traveled, traded, and exchanged genes across vast distances, creating genetic networks that spanned the continent. These findings challenged romantic notions of ancient peoples living in perfect isolation, unchanged for millennia. Hunter-gatherer societies maintained extensive contact networks. They exchanged valuable materials, shared technologies, and probably maintained marriage alliances that prevented inbreeding. The White Hawk Girls community, though culturally conservative, wasn't living in total isolation from the wider world. Her story also highlighted the arbitrary nature of which individuals survive in the archaeological record. Thousands of children died in Neolithic Britain, but most left no trace. Acidic British soils destroy organic material, including bones, in most environments. The White Hawk Girl survived because her burial in a chalk cave provided unusually good preservation conditions. Neutral pH protecting bones from acid dissolution. This preservation bias means we never access a representative sample of past populations. We find individuals buried in particular locations, with particular treatments, whose bones happened to survive millennia of chemical and biological attack. The White Hawk girl represents not necessarily a typical child of her era, but one whose high-status burial in favorable conditions allowed her bones to endure. Yet, even with these limitations, she provides invaluable information. Each successfully analyzed ancient genome adds to our understanding of past populations, their movements, their adaptations, and their genetic relationships. The White Hawk girl's DNA became one data point in a growing database that allows researchers to track how human populations across Europe changed over thousands of years. The research also demonstrated DNA's ability to challenge assumptions. When archaeologists first examined her skeleton in the Victorian era, they almost certainly imagined she looked like a modern British child. Pale skin, probably light hair. These assumptions weren't based on evidence, but on unexamined beliefs about racial continuity and European identity. DNA forced a reckoning with these assumptions. The science didn't care about expectations or preferences. It simply reported what the genetic code revealed. This objectivity makes ancient DNA a powerful tool for overturning biased interpretations. Though it also requires careful communication to prevent misunderstanding or misuse of findings. The White Hawk girl's voice, speaking through her DNA, told a story that nobody anticipated. She embodied human evolution's complexity, showing that our species' history involves constant change, mixing, and adaptation, rather than stable racial categories. Her silence ended not through her own agency, but through scientific techniques that allowed researchers to read the genetic messages preserved in her bones. Today, the White Hawk girl's skeleton resides in climate-controlled storage at the Brighton Museum, carefully preserved for future research. Her bones, once forgotten in Victorian archives, now rank among the most scientifically valuable specimens in British archaeology. Small samples have been distributed to laboratories worldwide, each analysis adding new insights into her life and times. She has become a symbol of scientific progress, of historical complexity, of the dangers of assumptions about the past. Her reconstructed face appears in documentaries, museum exhibits, and textbooks. She challenges viewers to reconsider what they think they know about European history and human diversity. Educational programs use her story to teach about evolution, genetics, and migration. Students learn that human appearance isn't fixed or ancient, but constantly evolving in response to environmental pressures and population movements. Her combination of dark skin and blue eyes, impossible seeming to modern eyes, demonstrates that trait combinations we think of as natural are actually recent and contingent. The scientific papers describing her DNA have been cited thousands of times, sparking additional research across Europe and beyond. Archaeologists returned to museum collections, seeking other skeletons from the same period for DNA analysis. Each new sample refined the picture of Mesolithic and Neolithic populations, their relationships, and their transformations. Her story also enters broader conversations about identity and belonging. In an era of increasing migration and ethnic mixing, she reminds us that all modern populations represent mixtures of ancient groups that would be unrecognizable to us. The concept of pure, unchanging ethnic groups finds no support in the genetic record. Humans have always moved, mixed, and adapted. This message sometimes meets resistance. People invested in particular narratives about their ancestry may reject findings that complicate those narratives. The White Hawk girl's dark skin contradicts ideas about ancient Europeans as uniformly pale, challenging nationalist ideologies that invoke distant ancestors to justify modern ethnic categories. But science doesn't operate by democratic vote or ideological preference. The DNA evidence stands, regardless of whether people find it convenient or comfortable. The White Hawk girl looked the way she looked because of her genetic inheritance, which reflected her ancestors' evolutionary history. No amount of wishful thinking can change the genetic code preserved in her bones. Future research will undoubtedly add new dimensions to her story. DNA analysis technology improves constantly, allowing extraction of information from smaller samples and more degraded material. Techniques that couldn't access her DNA in 2010 might work today. Methods being developed now might reveal details currently invisible to us. Researchers might someday extract pathogen DNA clearly enough to identify exactly what disease killed her. They might find additional genetic markers revealing personality traits, cognitive abilities, or health predispositions. They might identify living descendants carrying fragments of her genome, connecting modern people to this child who died 5,600 years ago. Her legacy extends beyond pure science into philosophy and ethics. She forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What does ancestry mean when our ancestors looked completely different from us? How do we construct identity when genetic evidence shows constant population mixing and replacement? What stories do we tell about the past? And whose interests do those stories serve? The White Hawk Girl demands intellectual humility. We must acknowledge that our assumptions about the past are often wrong, that evidence can overturn long-held beliefs, that reality doesn't conform to our preferences or expectations. This humility serves us well in an increasingly complex, globalized world, where simple narratives about identity and belonging no longer suffice. She also represents the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. Her story emerged only through cooperation between archaeologists, geneticists, isotope specialists, forensic reconstructionists, and many other experts. No single discipline could have revealed the complete picture. Only by combining multiple lines of evidence, skeletal analysis, DNA sequencing, isotope chemistry, burial context, could researchers reconstruct her life, death, and significance. In museums, her story attracts diverse audiences. Children marvel at the blue-eyed girl with dark skin. Adults confront their assumptions about race and history. Students learn about cutting-edge science transforming archaeology. Everyone encounters evidence that the past was stranger and more complex than they imagined. The White Hawk Girl has become immortal, in a way her community couldn't have anticipated. They buried her carefully, hoping perhaps that her spirit would journey to an afterlife or be reborn in their own religious framework. They couldn't have imagined that thousands of years later, scientists would extract her genetic code and reconstruct her face. They couldn't have known she would become famous, her image reaching millions of people worldwide. Yet, in essential ways, their care for her succeeded. They wanted her remembered, honored, treated with respect. Through the accident of preservation and the power of modern science, she is remembered, not just as an anonymous skeleton, but as a distinct individual whose face we can see, whose appearance we can describe, whose place in human history we can define. She reminds us that every skeleton in every archaeological site represents a person who lived, breathed, loved, suffered, and died. Behind the abstract discussions of populations and migrations stand millions of individual lives, most forever lost to history. The White Hawk Girl emerged from that anonymity, her DNA giving her a voice that speaks across millennia, telling us truths about ourselves we never expected to hear.